welcome to the Raven Cycle reread with me, Katja, at Obviously Queer. I'm wearing this wonderful workout outfit, not because I'm working out, I never do. One of the things that I really want to talk about is the timeline. Thankfully for you guys, I am a psychopath and I did this timeline. Maggie herself has said that she doesn't like to write books that are very clearly a special year, and that she wanted to write the Raven Cycle so that if you read it in 2022, it can take place in 2022. But for the simplicity of it, I did choose to set it in 2012. So 7 years prior to this book, Gansey dies and Noah dies and Gansey resurrects. Gansey starts the Glendower hunt around 2008. He then travels to Mexico, he then travels to the UK with Mallory, he then travels in Iceland, and after that he moves to Henrietta. In my head, when I read these books for the first time, I imagined that Ronan and Gansey had been friends longer than 2 years, but canonly, they have not. In chapter 4 of The Raven Boys, Adam Parrish had been Gansey's friend for 18 months. This is not possible for several reasons. One being that 18 months from the start of The Raven Boys is when Gansey came to Henrietta. And this would mean that Gansey had been friends with Adam and Ronan for the same amount of time, which we know they haven't. That also means that Adam would have known Ronan before Niall died, and this we also know is not the case. My timeline is that Gansey came to Henrietta in the summer of 2010, Niall died the 3rd week in June 2011, Ronan moves in with him the last week of June 2011, and it's sometime around September 2011 they befriend Adam. Adam does not know Ronan before Niall dies, but he is present when Ronan tries to kill himself. And it's explicit in the book that Ronan tries to kill himself 6 months before The Raven Boys, which is in October 2011. And the 24th of April 2012, The Raven Boys start. Blue is 16, Ronan, Adam, Gansey are 17, Declan is 18. And there you have it, the pre-story of The Raven Boys. I will link this timeline below if anyone wants to look at it. Another thing that I would love to talk about today is the physical appearance of the main characters of this book. There is a norm in the Raven Cycle fandom, as well as in many other fandoms, that you kind of twinkify the characters and you make them much more conventionally beautiful than is written in the book, and this really is a hill that I could die on. Maggie has shared her fancast of Noah, which looks like this. It's a normal guy, you know, he could go to my school. The way people fancast Noah, someone unironically had casted Harry Styles as their fancast for Noah. And this just tunes into like a bigger pet peeve of mine, which is people making the characters into this kind of cute, much more conventionally beautiful people than they are in the book. But what I actually want to talk about is Adam. I feel like the fandom has a very clear picture of how the rest of the characters look. In my head, Gansey looks like the I had to do it to them guy. But Noah, as mentioned, and especially Adam, people picture him so differently, and I think that's super interesting because I have a really clear image of what Adam looks like. Because I see a lot of fan art with Adam with like curly hair and freckles, and that's so far away from how I picture him. And therefore, I'm just gonna bring the receipts to start with. This is how Maggie herself draws Adam. And the things about Adam's looks that are canon is that he's tall, he is slim, he looks like a sepia photograph, and two things that I actually haven't thought about before is that it says in the book that he has the same features as his mom, and his mom is described as having elongated features and wide set eyes. He is described as having hair the same color as dirt, which is very abstract, but in chapter 23 it also says that his hair was the same colorless brown as the tips of old grass. And this, you guys, this is an actual color. This is not relevant really, except that I find it really fun to talk about. It's also canon that he has constant dark circles under his eyes. And you guys draw him as pretty. One of my favorite, no, not one of, my favorite minor character in the Raven Cycle is Helen Gansey. I love her way of speaking, I love her attitude, I love the way she's physically described, I love the way she talks to Gansey. Oh, Helen really is 100% my type of woman. I am terrified of her and also sexually attracted. This book is so fucking good. Every single time a chapter begins in the Raven Boys, I'm like, ah, this is such a powerful chapter. This is such a powerful chapter. I love the Raven Boys. Like, after the Dream Thieves, the Raven Boys is my favorite, especially to reread, because I mean, I know these people now. I know them better than like the majority of my friends. Hello and welcome to the last part of me rereading The Raven Boys. I have now finished it and I have so much to say, but I am going to keep it. I'm not gonna keep it short. I am instead going to focus on the betrayal of Adam and Adam's abuse, because that is something that really stuck with me. I think this has to do a lot with the fact that I read all, basically, of the 1-star reviews of all the books in the Raven Cycle. It just shed a lot of light on different things that people dislike about these books, especially the person who wrote that Adam's abuse was poorly written. I'm going to talk about 3 things that stood out to me in why I personally think that Adam's abuse is written in a way that is relatable, realistic, and heartbreaking. Also, I want to say that for this part, I have written a script, and I'm not a professional YouTuber, so I don't own a teleporter or whatever it's called. Sometimes you will see me just reading straight out of the script. The first part that I want to talk about is Adam's terrible choices. And this boils down to the simple question, why doesn't he leave? Adam's pride is extremely frustrating, and from a logical perspective, it doesn't make any sense. But the Raven Cycle, nor Adam's story in the Raven Cycle, isn't a fairy tale, it's a realistic portrayal of abuse. And everyone has experienced some kind of violence, and when I talk about violence in this video, I mean emotional, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual violence, all kinds of violence that you can do to a person. And everyone who's lived with any of those, to yourself or someone close to you, know that this subject is very, very complex. And the question of why doesn't they leave is extremely complex. Adam's story in The Raven Boys deals with this in a way that is non-dramatic and that is very true to the complexity of this question. All of this boils down to the fact that Adam has this fixed idea on one way to do it. Since Adam has been abused his entire life and he's been hit by his father since his childhood, he does not see himself in any other way than the abused kid. And he's terrified that no one else is going to see him in any other way than the abused kid. This we see, for example, in Call Down the Hawk. He erases this part of his childhood. This is understandable too, because the most important thing for Adam is to be able to be his own person. This is the core of Adam's whole personality. And because of this, he has gotten into his head that there is only one way for him to leave his abusive home. He has to do it on his own terms. He cannot accept help from anyone else doing so, because then he has not escaped from his trauma as his own person. Is this logical from an outside view? No. Absolutely not. Is this logical when you understand the complexity of why doesn't he leave? Absolutely. The fact that Adam has tunnel vision on this one way to leave his father results in the fact that he stays much longer than he should. He does not accept any help, and overall, he does not make the best choices for himself. And this attitude that this gives him, apart from the fact that it's extremely frustrating as a reader and for the people close to him that he stays, even though he has several ways out of his abusive home, it's just not his fixed way of doing so, is frustrating. This also creates other parts of Adam's personality that is very unlikable. The stubbornness, the proudness, the anger issues, the anger fits, the fact that he very often feels entitled to things that he's not entitled to and does not feel he's entitled to things that are basic human rights. All of this makes Adam so much in the Raven Boys acting like a fucking asshole. It is personality traits that isn't charming, and Maggie isn't trying to make him charming. I mean, people can have unlikable traits in especially young adult that is unlikable in this kind of charming way. You know, the dark, broody, handsome man who doesn't let anyone in. I mean, that's a trope of an unlikable character, but really he is quite likable. But Adam is straight up so often an uncharming character. He has deep, personal, problematic issues that are an effect of his trauma. And this is positive representation for me because it is realistic representation. I've said this before and I will say it again. What doesn't kill you can make you stronger, but very often and in real life, what doesn't kill you makes you a less likable person. The things that I've experienced that didn't kill me, they didn't make me stronger, they made me weaker. And I think it's nice to see in a YA that Adam's abuse, it hasn't made him a stronger, more individual person. It's made him a barely functioning human being who very often hurt other people and himself. I think when you talk about the question, why don't they leave? When you talk about victims of abuse, you think that they don't leave because they're scared. And this is very often a vital part of it. Your abuser holds too much power over your life. This is the factor with Adam as well. And he is also scared that Adam's dad will shoot him or his mom if he leaves. But it is also Adam double thinking, what negative effect does that have on his life? If Adam turned his father in, everything crashed down around him. If Adam turned him in, his mother would never forgive him. If Adam turned him in, he could never come home again. And this leads us into the second point, and that is Adam's homesickness. Adam missed his home, even though that home was abusive to him. This is very important to me, and I think it's also very important for other people who have experienced any kind of trauma. After Adam has moved into Monmouth, he thinks this. A new wave of misery washed over him, and he could identify its source very precisely. Homesickness. But lying in the black of night, all he could think was, my mother will never speak to me again. I am homeless. This is also Adam's POV later in the book. He was full of so many wants, too many to prioritize, to go home, to have hit his father himself, to own an apartment, to belong somewhere, to go home, to go home, to go home. As Adam himself says and logically thinks, he knows that he has been affected by Stockholm Syndrome. He second guesses his own experiences. There is something wrong with him. He being hit because he deserves it. All of those things are in Adam's mind. He's very capable of seeing both that he feels that way and that that feeling is an effect of the trauma. It's rare to read on page is a victim of abuse who openly and explicitly misses parts of that life. One of the hardest things for me in my own journey of PTSD and overcoming trauma was this balance of accepting and seeing the feeling that I very often missed parts of the life that gave me PTSD, at the same time as I very clearly could see that that was an extremely violent part of my life, and I am very relieved that I'm not in it anymore. This is very common amongst people who have PTSD, but it's very rarely talked about because it is shameful to miss something that you are good to be without. And here in the Raven Boys, Maggie just lets Adam feel all that. There's no value in it. Adam feels a kind of shame, but it's not written with any kind of value that this should be shameful. He just sees and knows and tells the reader that he does miss his home, and it's always something very soothing and powerful for me to read this part. And number 3 of why I think Adam's abuse is realistically and wonderfully written is the victim blaming from his friends. This is a drinking game that I found online, and I thought it was funny because it is actually very common in the Raven Boys that Adam especially is victim blamed. I mean, you can question maybe why I think this is a good portrayal of abuse, but again, I think a good portrayal of trauma and a good portrayal of abuse is a realistic portrayal of abuse. If we're looking at this in the Raven cycle with a bigger spectrum than just Adam, one of my favorite things in the portrayal of these characters as flawed teenagers is that they make so many mistakes. Why I like the victim blaming in the Raven Boys is not because I think that Adam deserves it, obviously. I think it's because it's a realistic portrayal, and I think it adds so much to the characters of the other characters that they do such mistakes in the relationship with Adam. It is hard to meet someone who has the attitude and the mindset that Adam has in the Raven Boys, and the other people are also carrying trauma. Gansey is carrying trauma, Ronan is carrying trauma. When you're talking about victim blaming in the Raven Boys, the most famous quote is, "I'm sorry your father never taught you the meaning of repugnant. He was too busy smashing your head against the wall of your trailer while you apologized for being alive." Adam is in an extremely vulnerable position, and so is Gansey. He knows this is not what Adam wants. He knows that Adam will find it excruciating that Gansey has to pay for his hospital bill, so Gansey meets him with that attitude, which is the completely wrong thing to do. But also, in the same scene as this scene, Gansey says so many other stuff. One of the first things that Gansey says to Adam when Adam gets in the car just after the hospital, "You don't have to act like it's the end of the world." And Adam says it is the end of the world, which is logical. For Adam, it is the end of the world. This is not dramatic. I really don't think this is dramatic. And then Gansey says, "End of the world? What is your problem, Adam?" This is awful, but I think it is such an important scene because it really highlights the problematic aspects of Gansey and Adam's relationship. I mean, it's both of their most problematic personalities meeting in an extreme clash. It is so heartbreaking. I just think it's very, very bravely and well written that Gansey fails to meet his best friend in this scene of vulnerability for him. And like a day after or something like that, Adam goes to Blue to be comforted, and Blue tells him, extremely unprovoked, "There's still worse than what you've got." It's so terrible, but I still like it. As I talked about in the first part about Adam's unlikable traits, the way that other people move around Adam, how they treat him because of his trauma, and that kind of dynamic that it creates, and the mistakes that they make with him and so on, is another example of Maggie writing really complex, flawed characters. All of this, why it's so important to Adam to be a man of his own, is extremely important to understand why Adam sacrificing himself to Capewater is such a huge sacrifice. He does everything to not be product, an extent, a consequence of his dad and then Gansey. Because when I read this book for the first time and I didn't know Adam like I know Adam now, I thought that his sacrifice of giving up his body and his control was like, okay. And there are several times in the Raven Boys when Adam himself, or especially Gansey, talks about Adam's abuse in a very specific way. Adam had the sick feeling that his father had managed to knock something crucial askew. This is Gansey's POV. He imagined coming here one day and finding that Adam wasn't here but in the hospital, or worse, that Adam was here but that something important had been beaten out of him. This was the hardest thing to internalize, that something permanent but invisible had happened. This is the biggest fear for both of them. He will be abused so badly that he becomes someone else. And When Adam has sacrificed himself and his body to Capeswater, this is how Adam is described. There was a crushing sadness to Gansey's face as he looked at Adam. That was the first clue Blue got that something was inherently different, irretrievably altered. If not about the world, then about Adam. I don't think this is a coincidence in the way that it's written. That was that. Another thing that I really thought about while reading The Raven Boys now for the 4th time is, speaking of sadness and speaking of sacrifices, is Noah. Oh, now I'm gonna say that I'm gonna start spoiling the Dreamer Trilogy. So if you haven't read the Dreamer Trilogy and you don't want to be spoiled but you still want to follow this video, I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you and bye if that was the case. Otherwise, rereading The Raven Boys and reading Noah's character when you know that no one remembers him in the Dreamer Trilogy adds so much to his character. When I read this book for the first time, I didn't like Noah because I thought it was boring and I thought that he was forgettable and he didn't really add anything to the character dynamic. But now, because of the Dreamer Trilogy and because of the effect that I can feel Noah's sacrifice having, reading this scene, stepping forward, leaning over the hood of the car, Ronan pressed his finger to the windscreen and while I watched, he wrote, "Remembered." It's such a moving scene in so many ways. It is this early in the book an uncharacteristic thing for Ronan to do, to show that much love and affection publicly. I mean, this is up for debate, but I would 100% argue that Ronan is Noah's closest friend. Ronan doing this for him is so important for Noah, and then reading this scene and knowing that Ronan does not remember Noah at all after the Raven King is so heartbreaking. Reading this scene when they see him again after reburying his bones. Euphoric they all spun. Noah, rumpled and familiar, was framed in the arched doorway of the church, more solid than Blue remembered ever seeing him, solid in form anyway. He peered around the crumbled walls with a timorous expression. "Noah!" Gansey cried gladly, and then they all run out and they hug him. Reading that scene and knowing that not a single one of them has a single memory left of him after the Raven King is so sad. Maggie has written him intentionally boring because it's supposed to create a feeling with the writer that you can't really remember him when you finish that book. Noah's sacrifice is being forgotten by his family, his friends, and in this book. Like, it's so meta, it's so good. When the book is done, you won't think about him in the same way that you think about the other characters, and that is part of his sacrifice. Also, I think it's just extremely powerful. On page 255, when Graywaren is mentioned for the first time. Graywaren? If it's Latin, I don't know it. Ronan, whispered the trees. Ronan Lynch. It's you, Gansey said with wonder. So this is how the word Graywaren is introduced in this series, and now 10 years later the 3rd and last book is coming out and it's called Graywaren. It could basically just be called Ronan Lynch, and I think that's so powerful. It's introduced so early, Graywaren as a concept, Graywaren as an idea, Graywaren as something more than other dreamers. Ronan's, double identity as both Ronan Lynch, the teenage boy, and Graywaren, the dream entity. Also, rereading The Raven Boys, knowing Declan from the Dreamer Trilogy is such a wonderful experience. But I can't help thinking of Jordan and Declan's relationship in the Dreamer Trilogy. I mean, Declan is the definition of a male wife. He has such a submissive energy. Because Ashley has a kind of boss bitch aura, so I can't really help but to see Declan taste in women, someone who can dominate him, also in the Raven Boys, and I just think that's very fun. I know a lot of people think that Declan is going to die in the Dreamer Trilogy, and one of the reasons people think that is because now when we have read the Raven Cycle, we know Maggie's way of writing, we know her style, and especially we know her way of foreshadowing foreshadowing things. When you read The Raven Boys for the first time, you don't think so much about quotes like "I've been dead for 7 years" as a direct reference to him being dead for 7 years. We also don't think about the fact that Ronan's first line in The Raven Boys is to Gansey, and he says, "I thought you were dead in a ditch," which is how The Raven King ends. Gansey dying in a ditch. But now we do. So in Called on the Hawk, in the second chapter, when Ronan says to Declan, "We'll be driving to your funeral by the end," this is phrased as a classic Maggie foreshadowing to Declan dying in the end and them driving to his funeral. But I think this is too easy. I think that Maggie knows that we know that she writes this kind of foretellings. We're supposed to think that this is classic Maggie foreshadowing, and someone else is going to die instead, which will be a much bigger shock because now everyone thinks that Declan is going to die. I don't think Declan is going to die for several reasons, but I don't know, he could. Like, Maggie has explicitly said that Ronan will be in a good place by the end of the Dreamer Trilogy, and I have a hard time seeing that he will be in a good place if he has lost Declan as well. This is a long video. If you have stayed to the end, I am so glad to have you here. This was so much fun. I look forward to seeing you all again for my reread of the Dreamer Trilogy. Until then, have a wonderful day and I'll see you around eventually. Tell me what did you want?